The air over Southeast Asia hung heavy in late 1941, thick with heat, humidity, and tension. To the British commanders stationed in Singapore, it seemed impossible that their fortress could ever fall. Massive naval guns pointed toward the sea, the city's defenses gleaming in the tropical sun, its officers confident in the power of the empire. They called Singapore the Gibraltar of the East, but the storm was already gathering, unseen behind the monsoon clouds. Far to the north, across the Gulf of Siam, Japanese troop transports slipped silently through the night. The men aboard were hardened veterans of the China campaign, trained in jungle warfare and fueled by an iron belief in the destiny of their empire. Their faces were calm, unreadable as officers briefed them under the dim light of lanterns. The operation had a single, ruthless purpose: crush British power in the region before the Western Allies could even react. On December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese struck Malaya. The thunder of naval gunfire rolled across the coastline at Kota Baru, while paratroopers descended on airfields in Thailand. The British, still reeling from news of Hawaii, found themselves under siege in their own colonial backyard. The Japanese moved with terrifying speed, advancing south through dense jungle and swamps, bypassing strongpoints and cutting off communication lines. Where British officers expected terrain to slow the invaders, the Japanese used bicycles, fast, silent, and unstoppable. In the colonial clubs of Singapore, disbelief turned to dread. Officers and civil servants huddled around radios, hearing the first reports of the invasion. Impossible, some muttered. They wouldn't dare, yet the sound of distant thunder, not from storms but from artillery, carried through the humid night. The war that had seemed so far away had come crashing to their doorstep. British strategy in Malaya had long been built on arrogance and underestimation. The jungle, they believed, was impassable. The Royal Navy, they insisted, would always control the sea. But the fleet's pride, the battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, steamed north from Singapore without air cover. And on December 10th, Japanese bombers from Indochina found them. In a matter of hours, both ships were sunk, swallowed by the South China Sea. Over 800 sailors perished. The illusion of naval supremacy died with them. News of the disaster swept through Singapore like wildfire. The city that once glimmered with confidence now trembled. The streets filled with whispers of invasion, of Japanese planes already seen overhead, of spies and saboteurs in the shadows. Blackout curtains were drawn tight each night, and the once bright colonial nightlife faded into anxious silence. In the north, British and Commonwealth troops, Australians, Indians, and Malays, fought desperate delaying actions. They were brave, but poorly equipped. Their tanks were outdated, their air support scarce, their commanders still adjusting to a new kind of war. The Japanese struck with coordination and cunning, flanking positions through thick undergrowth and striking where least expected. Villages burned, civilians fled in endless lines down muddy roads, carrying what little they could. At Alor Star and Jitra, entire British battalions were thrown into chaos. The Japanese, using light tanks and relentless mortar fire, tore through defensive lines like a blade through paper. Survivors described the horror, comrades screaming in the darkness, the crack of rifle fire, the hiss of mortars raining down from unseen positions, rain mixed with blood in the trenches. By late December, the Japanese advance seemed unstoppable. One officer wrote in his diary, "We fight not to win, but to delay the inevitable." Even as command in Singapore assured London that all was under control, units in the field were being cut off and annihilated. The jungle was no ally. It swallowed men whole. The humidity rotted uniforms, the insects carried disease, and every tree seemed to hide an enemy sniper. Meanwhile, civilians in Singapore tried to pretend life went on. Children still attended school, markets still opened at dawn, but every night the sky glowed faintly red from fires far to the north. The refugees arriving from Malaya brought stories of horror, villages strafed, women and children shot as they fled, soldiers vanishing without trace. The city's hospitals overflowed with wounded, their bandages soaked in sweat and blood. By January 1942, the British Empire's myth of control had shattered. General Yamashita's forces, outnumbered but swift and disciplined, were closing in. In London, Prime Minister Churchill demanded that Singapore be held at all costs. But costs had already been paid in thousands of lives. In the heart of Singapore, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival studied maps late into the night, cigarette smoke curling above his head. The ink on his plans blurred with sweat as he tried to hold back the tide. His men were tired, his supplies thin, his airfields bombed daily. Yet orders were clear: hold the fortress. To surrender was unthinkable. The irony was cruel. The mighty guns of Singapore, built to repel a naval assault from the south, were nearly useless. The Japanese were coming by land from the north. As bombers screamed overhead and columns of smoke rose beyond the Johor Strait, Percival's thoughts turned not to victory, but to survival. The people of Singapore began digging trenches and shelters. Barricades went up across streets. The once proud British colony now waited in fearful silence for the storm to reach them. Somewhere beyond the jungle, the roar of tanks and the tramp of boots drew closer. The fall of Singapore had not yet come, but its shadow already stretched across the land. By the final days of December 1941, Malaya was burning. Villages once wrapped in the hum of insects and prayer were now drowned beneath the roar of engines and artillery. Japanese columns pushed relentlessly southward, their discipline unbroken even in the choking heat. Behind them, the remnants of British and Commonwealth forces stumbled through mud and chaos, retreating from one shattered position to another. The war in Malaya was not the grand, sweeping confrontation that British commanders had imagined. It was a war of movement, confusion, and terror. The Japanese struck fast and vanished faster, appearing where they were least expected. British and Indian troops, trained for European terrain, found themselves fighting in a living nightmare, a jungle that swallowed sound, stifled breath, and offered no horizon. The air reeked of rot and cordite, Lee Enfield rifles jammed from humidity. Boots sank into red clay, thick with rain and blood. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding the Japanese 25th Army, had one unbreakable order: advance without pause. His men called him the Tiger of Malaya. He drove his forces like a storm, infantry on bicycles, tanks modified for tropical terrain, engineers building makeshift bridges over rivers once thought impassable. Each time British defenders dug in, the Japanese outflanked them through the jungle. Each time the British expected a pause, the enemy was already at their rear. At the Battle of Gibraltar, December 1113, British units were overwhelmed before their defences were even completed. Artillery positions were bombed into silence. Communication lines snapped. Reports poured in of Japanese tanks appearing from the mist, their engines echoing through rubber plantations. Panic spread faster than gunfire. Commanders lost contact with their men. One officer recalled watching his line disappear into the trees, swallowed by the sound of screaming. By Christmas, British morale was collapsing. Reinforcements from Australia and the 8th Division arrived too late, many of them fresh recruits facing veterans hardened in China. In the town of Kampar, they made a stand. From December 30th to January 2nd, 1942, the Australians and Indian troops fought ferociously, holding their ground against repeated Japanese assaults. The hills shook with shell fire. The smell of burned rubber and blood filled the air. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand among the limestone ridges. When the order to withdraw finally came, they did so under the cover of darkness, leaving behind their dead and the faint sound of distant cheering from the Japanese lines. Each retreat carved deeper scars into the soul of the defenders. The British press back home still spoke of strategic withdrawals, but on the ground Men knew the truth. They were losing. Bridges were blown, towns abandoned, and thousands of civilians caught between the lines. Along the roads leading south, columns of refugees, Malays, Chinese, Indians, and Europeans alike, trudged through monsoon rain, their faces hollow with exhaustion. In one village outside Kuala Kangsar, a British field hospital was overrun. Nurses, local volunteers, and wounded soldiers were executed. News of the massacre spread quickly, feeding both terror and rage. For the Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated since youth, to see surrender as shameful, compassion was weakness. To the captured, mercy was rare. In the skies above, the Japanese dominated. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered and outclassed, was hunted from the airfields one by one. Blenheim bombers burned on the tarmac. Hurricanes were shot down before they could climb above the palm trees. The defenders looked upward at the distant silver glint of enemy planes and realized the skies belonged to the rising sun. By January, the British were forced into a fighting withdrawal to the south of the peninsula. The Japanese swept through Kuala Lumpur with barely a fight. They captured intact fuel depots, abandoned trucks, and warehouses bursting with British supplies. To Yamashita, it was proof of divine favor. To the British, a humiliation. Every mile south tightened the noose around Singapore. At Slim River, January 7th, came disaster. Japanese tanks broke through a key defensive position before dawn, catching the British 11th Indian Division while it was still forming up. In less than 5 hours, 2 brigades were annihilated. Trucks overturned in panic. Infantrymen, dazed and deafened, stumbled into the jungle with no idea where the front line was. Officers tried to rally their men, but the roads were jammed with burning vehicles. Survivors described the nightmare. Tank engines grinding over corpses, tracer rounds cutting through trees, the screams of wounded men echoing in the dark. The road to Singapore lay open. From that moment, the collapse became inevitable. British commanders argued bitterly in their field tents, some demanding a final stand, others insisting on withdrawal. The chain of command frayed under the weight of defeat. Each decision meant abandoning more men. Each retreat brought the Japanese closer to the fortress city that was supposed to stand unconquered for 100 years. By late January 1942, the Japanese had reached Johor, the final barrier before Singapore. Across the narrow strait, the lights of the city flickered in the distance. Once a beacon of British imperial pride, now a trembling promise of refuge. In the tropical heat, soldiers dug trenches and strung barbed wire, knowing that the enemy was already watching from the other shore. Within Singapore, panic began to grip the population. Air raids became nightly rituals. Civilians huddled in basements as bombs tore through the city. The once proud Raffles Hotel, symbol of colonial grandeur, now served as a military hospital. The air smelled of antiseptic and fear. Hospitals overflowed with wounded from the north, their bodies bandaged and broken, their eyes hollow. British propaganda still spoke of defiance, of holding out until reinforcements arrived. But there were no reinforcements. Burma was threatened, Hong Kong had fallen, and the American fleet was crippled at Pearl Harbor. Singapore was alone. General Percival toured the front lines, his face drawn and pale. He saw the exhaustion in his men's eyes, the disbelief in their silence. He tried to project confidence, but even he could feel the truth pressing down like the humid air. The fortress was not ready for siege. Ammunition was low, food was rationed, and morale was fading fast. Across the strait, Yamashita prepared his final assault. He had fewer men than Percival believed, only around 30,000 combat-ready troops. But he understood the enemy's weakness. British command still assumed a frontal attack from the northeast. Yamashita chose the opposite. He would strike at the western sector, where mangroves and tidal swamps offered no easy defense. It was a plan born from daring and deception. On the night of February 8th, the sky over Johor turned crimson. Japanese artillery opened fire, the thunder rolling across the strait. Thousands of shells rained upon Singapore's beaches. Civilians awoke in terror as entire neighborhoods shook. Then, as the guns fell silent, black shapes emerged from the water, assault boats gliding through the dark, engines muffled, oars dipping soundlessly. The invasion of Singapore had begun. At Sarimbun Beach, British and Australian defenders opened fire. Tracer rounds cut through the night like lightning, machine guns rattled. But the Japanese came on, wave after wave, shouting war cries, their faces painted black for night assault. Many fell, but more followed. The swampy ground turned to mud as blood and seawater mixed. Within hours, the defenders' lines buckled. Communications broke down. The Japanese established a foothold on the island. By dawn, the smoke rose high enough to be seen from the city center. Fire lit the horizon. The once proud fortress was now a battlefield. The Gibraltar of the East was under siege. The inferno had begun, and with it, the beginning of the end. By February 9, 1942, Singapore was a city under fire. The sky was a black canopy of smoke and flame. Entire districts burned as Japanese artillery pounded the island without mercy. The thunder of explosions rolled through the streets, echoing off the colonial facades that once symbolized British power. Civilians huddled in shelters, their faces pale and eyes hollow. In every corner of the city, the realization had set in. The enemy was no longer across the strait. They were here. The British and Commonwealth defenders, numbering around 85,000, outnumbered the Japanese nearly 3-1. Yet numbers meant nothing. Ammunition was dwindling, communication lines shattered, morale fractured. Many soldiers were exhausted after months of retreat through Malaya, their uniforms soaked with sweat and grime, their minds haunted by defeat. They fought now not for victory, but for survival. At the Western Front, Australian troops from the 22nd Brigade bore the brunt of the assault. The Japanese 5th Division advanced through mangroves and swamps, their movements precise, relentless, and silent. They carried light weapons and moved swiftly, slipping through terrain the defenders believed impassable. When the Australians opened fire, the jungle erupted with muzzle flashes. The smell of salt water and gunpowder filled the air. At midnight, flares lit the sky like false dawns. Entire sections of coastline became infernos. In the chaos, British lines began to falter. Commanders struggled to relay orders as telephone lines were severed by shell fire. Radios jammed. Confusion spread like wildfire. Units became isolated, surrounded by an enemy that seemed to materialize from the darkness itself. In Bukit Timah, one of the island's highest points, British and Indian troops made their stand. From this ridge ran the last roads leading into the city, and the Japanese wanted them. On February 10th, Yamashita launched a massive assault. Tanks rolled forward through the night, their treads grinding over shattered pavement and bodies alike. The defenders fought fiercely, firing until their rifles overheated, throwing grenades until their belts were empty. The noise was deafening, a constant rolling roar of artillery, the screams of the wounded, the metallic clang of empty shell casings hitting the ground. The air grew thick with the stench of burning oil. A British depot had been set ablaze, an inferno that lit the night sky for miles. Flames danced across the horizon, revealing silhouettes of advancing Japanese soldiers. Snipers fired from rooftops. Machine guns rattled from hidden nests. For every yard gained, blood was spilled. By dawn, Bukit Timah had fallen. The road to the city lay open. Inside Singapore, chaos reigned. Tens of thousands of civilians poured into the streets, clutching children and belongings, desperate to flee the shelling. Hospitals were overwhelmed, water mains ruptured, fires burned unchecked. The once proud colonial capital had become a vision of apocalypse. British officers tried to maintain order, directing refugees toward underground shelters. But fear had taken root too deep. Rumors of massacres and atrocities spread faster than gunfire. General Percival watched the city crumble from his headquarters at Fort Canning. Maps lay scattered across his desk, covered in scribbled arrows and circles. Each line marked another loss, another retreat. His commanders pleaded for reinforcements that didn't exist. Ammunition was nearly gone, food supplies were collapsing, the reservoirs at Makrichi and Pierce were under threat. If the Japanese seized them, the city would die of thirst before it fell to the sword. Yamashita knew it. His strategy now was psychological as much as tactical. He ordered constant bombardment, day and night, to break the defenders' will. Bombs fell on markets, hospitals, even churches. The Japanese loudspeakers blared across no man's land. "You are surrounded, resistance is useless, surrender and live." The words echoed through the ruins. Yet still, some fought with desperate courage. At Pasir Panjang, the Malay regiment, young, under-equipped, and vastly outnumbered, made their final stand. On February 13th, Japanese troops attacked in waves. The Malays fought from trenches and pillboxes, refusing to yield even as ammunition ran out. When the Japanese finally breached the line, the defenders fought with bayonets and fists. Lieutenant Adnan bin Saidi led the last stand at Bukit Chandu, Opium Hill. Wounded but unyielding, he rallied his men, shouting above the gunfire, "We will fight to the last!" When the position finally fell, Adnan was captured, beaten, and executed. His courage became legend, a symbol of defiance carved into the bloodied soil of Singapore. Elsewhere, chaos deepened. British troops fell back toward the city centre, burning fuel dumps and supplies to deny them to the enemy. Smoke choked the air, turning day into dusk. The sound of shellfire never stopped. Streets once lined with palm trees and whitewashed villas were now rubble-strewn battlegrounds. Dead soldiers and civilians alike lay where they fell, their bodies covered with dust and flies. Inside command posts, discipline faltered. Some units refused orders, others deserted entirely. Drunken soldiers looted stores for food or whiskey, knowing the end was near. Yet amidst the despair there were moments of grim heroism. Medics dragging the wounded through shellfire, volunteers ferrying water under the eyes of snipers, priests praying over the dying as bombs fell around them. On February 14, Japanese troops broke through the final defensive ring near Adam Road. They were now within artillery range of the city's heart. The British counterattacked briefly, but their strength was gone. Ammunition was counted bullet by bullet. Each explosion brought the defenders closer to collapse. That same night, Yamashita sent a final message to Percival, demanding surrender. His troops, though victorious, were nearly exhausted themselves, low on supplies, short of ammunition, and outnumbered. But Percival didn't know that. All he saw was the destruction of his command and the suffering of 1 million civilians trapped in a dying city. The next morning, February 15, 1942, the decision could no longer be postponed. Percival met with his senior officers in the dim light of Fort Canning's bunker. The air was thick with sweat and silence. Some argued to fight on, to make the Japanese pay for every inch. Others pointed to the empty ammunition crates, the wounded filling every corridor, the risk of total massacre if the city fell by storm. At 5:15 p.m., a white flag was raised. Percival and his staff drove through the smoking ruins to the Ford Motor Factory at Bukit Timah, now Yamashita's headquarters. Along the road they passed wrecked trucks, corpses, and lines of dazed civilians. The sound of gunfire still echoed in the distance. Inside the factory, beneath the flicker of electric lights, Yamashita waited. His uniform was immaculate despite the dust of battle. He spoke through an interpreter, calm but cold. "You are beaten. Will you surrender unconditionally?" Percival, hollow-eyed, hesitated. The words hung heavy in the air. When he finally nodded, the room fell silent. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the world had just suffered its greatest humiliation. That night, Japanese troops marched through the streets of Singapore in triumph. The rising sun flags fluttered from government buildings. Civilians watched in stunned disbelief. The city that once believed itself invincible had fallen after just 7 days of battle. The dream of British power in Asia died amid smoke and ruins. In the hospitals, wounded soldiers stared at the ceiling, listening to the tramp of enemy boots outside. Nurses wept silently as the Japanese patrols entered. For many, captivity was only the beginning of another kind of hell. Forced marches, starvation, and years in brutal camps. Singapore, once the Gibraltar of the East, now lay silent beneath the shadow of a new empire. The defenders had fought bravely, but bravery could not change the tide. The fortress had fallen not only to bombs and bullets, but to arrogance, underestimation, and the swift, merciless force of modern war. The desperate defense was over. What remained was the reckoning. The guns fell silent on the evening of February 15, 1942, but peace did not return to Singapore. The air still trembled from distant explosions. Fires burned through the night, painting the sky in shades of red and black. What had once been the Gibraltar of the East was now a city of ghosts, its pride broken, its streets littered with rubble and the dead. British soldiers lay down their arms, their faces grey with exhaustion, disbelief, and shame. The rising sun banners fluttered from government buildings, temples, and even lampposts. The British Empire, once the symbol of global power, had been brought to its knees in just 70 days. The Japanese called it a glorious victory, a triumph of discipline, courage, and destiny. Their propaganda hailed General Yamashita as the Tiger of Malaya. But beneath the celebration, the true face of conquest revealed itself. For the civilians of Singapore and for the tens of thousands of Allied prisoners, the nightmare had only just begun. When Japanese troops entered the city, order disintegrated, looters prowled the ruins, terrified refugees hid in basements and sewers. The smell of death hung over every street. Burned vehicles, shattered trams, and torn bodies lined the roads. The tropical heat turned the city into a furnace. Disease spread quickly: dysentery, cholera, fever. Hospitals had no medicine left, and the dead were buried in shallow pits or left where they fell. In the days following the surrender, Japanese patrols rounded up British, Australian, and Indian troops. Tens of thousands were herded into makeshift camps, the beginning of a long and brutal captivity. At Changi Barracks, once a proud British garrison, barbed wire and machine guns now marked the boundaries of a prison. Soldiers who had fought with honor were stripped of rank, belongings, and dignity. Food was scarce: a handful of rice, a cup of water, sometimes nothing. Those who collapsed from hunger or disease were beaten for weakness. The Japanese viewed surrender as shame, a stain that stripped a man of his worth. They saw the British prisoners not as soldiers, but as failures unworthy of respect. Guards mocked them, forced them to bow, and compelled officers to clean latrines. The same men who once ruled the colony now lived under the boots of their conquerors. But the civilians of Singapore faced an even darker fate. The Japanese occupation began with suspicion and vengeance. The military police, the feared Kempeitai, swept through neighborhoods, searching for resistance, spies, and anyone of Chinese descent suspected of aiding the Allies. What followed became one of the darkest chapters in the city's history: the Suk Ching massacre. From February to March 1942, thousands of Chinese men were rounded up from homes, schools, and shops. They were told they would be registered, screened for anti-Japanese sentiment. In truth, it was a death sentence. At remote beaches and quarries across the island, Punggol, Changi, Blakang Mati, they were lined up, hands bound, and machine-gunned into mass graves. The sea turned red. By the time the executions ended, estimates of the dead ranged from 25,000 to 50,000. Families searched for missing fathers and brothers, but the bodies were never returned. Singapore wept in silence. Meanwhile, British officers were sent north to work camps in Siam and Burma. forced labor for the Japanese war machine. There, under the burning sun, they carved through jungle and rock to build the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, later known as the Death Railway. Starved and beaten, they toiled barefoot in mud and filth. Malaria and cholera spread unchecked. Each mile of track was paid for with hundreds of lives. Men died standing up, their hands still clutching shovels. When they fell, the guards simply shouted for another prisoner to take their place. In the city, women bore the unseen scars of occupation. Many were assaulted, forced into servitude, or taken as comfort women for Japanese troops. Entire families disappeared overnight. Those who resisted were executed in the streets as warnings to others. Fear became a language everyone understood. The Japanese imposed strict control. Curfews, rationing, and censorship defined daily life. The sound of boots on pavement, the bark of orders in Japanese, and the slap of a rifle butt became the rhythm of survival. Yet beneath the terror, quiet resistance began to stir. Chinese secret societies, Malay villages, and even surviving British operatives formed underground networks, smuggling intelligence to the Allies and sabotaging Japanese supply lines. They knew the price of capture, torture, or death, but they acted anyway. In a city stripped of freedom, defiance became the only form of dignity left. General Yamashita, despite his victory, faced his own disillusionment. He had conquered Singapore, but at immense cost. His forces were stretched thin, his supply lines fragile, and his conscience uneasy. He had promised swift occupation and order, but what followed was chaos and bloodshed. The propaganda painted him as a hero, yet the horror unfolding beneath his command would haunt his legacy forever. Across the world, news of Singapore's fall sent shockwaves through the Allied nations. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The Empire's myth of invincibility shattered overnight. Colonies that once looked to Britain for protection now saw its weakness laid bare. Across Asia, people began to question imperial rule itself. For the Japanese, Singapore was proof that the West could be defeated. Their propaganda called it Shonan II, Light of the South. They envisioned it as the jewel of their greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a new order free from Western domination. But beneath that vision lay brutality, hunger, and death. The people of Singapore soon learned that one empire's fall did not mean freedom, only a different master. As the months turned into years, life under occupation hardened the survivors. Black markets emerged in back alleys trading rice and medicine. Children scavenged among ruins. Priests and doctors risked their lives to shelter the wounded. Every whisper of Allied victories, Guadalcanal, Midway, Burma, became a flicker of hope. But for those inside the camps, time had lost all meaning. The seasons changed, and men disappeared like shadows, swallowed by disease and despair. In Changi prison, a British chaplain kept a hidden journal. His entries, smuggled out years later, told of men who sang hymns quietly in the dark, who shared crumbs of bread with the dying, who carved crosses from bamboo as symbols of endurance. Even in the pit of human suffering, the will to survive endured. The years that followed would see revenge and reckoning, but for now, Singapore slept under occupation, a city of whispers and ghosts. The Japanese ruled through fear, and yet even fear could not erase memory. The smell of burning oil, the cries from the beaches, the faces of the fallen, they lingered in every corner of the island. When the Allies finally returned in 1945, they found a city broken but unbowed. Starving prisoners emerged from their cages, their bodies thin but their spirits unbroken. Civilians wept in the streets as British soldiers marched once more through the city gates, not as conquerors, but as men returning to bury the past. The Japanese victory had been total in the moment, but hollow in its legacy. For every banner raised, 1,000 graves marked the price. For every cheer of triumph, there were cries of loss that would echo for generations. In the end, shadows of victory was all that remained. The human cost etched not in medals or maps, but in the memories of those who had lived through hell. The smoke of war eventually faded from the skies above Singapore, but its shadow never truly left. In 1945, when British forces returned, the island was a shell of its former self. The proud colonial city that once gleamed under tropical sun now stood hollow and haunted. The streets bore the scars of bombs and executions. The people carried wounds that ran far deeper, wounds of hunger, fear, and betrayal. The Japanese occupation had lasted 3.5 years, yet it felt like a lifetime. When the first Allied ships appeared on the horizon, survivors lined the docks in silence. There was no cheering, only tears. Emaciated prisoners staggered out from Changi and Sime road camps, some barely able to stand, their eyes sunken, their bodies broken, but their spirits intact. Civilians emerged from hiding, waving makeshift flags, clutching photographs of those who never returned. For them, liberation was not victory, it was survival. The returning British troops were greeted with gratitude, but also with something new and unspoken: doubt. The myth of the Empire's invincibility had died in February 1942. The people of Singapore, Malaya, and across Asia had seen the great colonial power fall to its knees. They had endured without its protection. For the first time, they began to question whether the British Empire was truly immortal. The seeds of independence had been planted, not by political speeches, but by suffering. The fall of Singapore was more than a military defeat. It was a turning point in world history. It marked the end of an age and the beginning of another. For Britain, it was a moment of reckoning, a brutal reminder that arrogance and outdated strategy could destroy even the mightiest of empires. For Japan, it was the height of triumph, the symbol of its imperial ambition. But the same ambition would soon become its undoing. Within 3 years, the conquerors themselves would be crushed beneath the weight of their own war. Hiroshima and Nagasaki would burn as Singapore once had, and Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, would stand trial for war crimes. When General Tomoyuki Yamashita faced justice in 1946, he remained calm, stoic, his expression unreadable. Found guilty for the atrocities committed under his command, he was executed by hanging. His final words were brief, almost whisper-like, "I have done my duty as a soldier." But history would remember him differently, as a man who won a war through brilliance and lost his soul through silence. For those who had lived under his victory, the pain endured long after the last gunfire faded. The survivors of the Sukching massacre carried their grief quietly. Mothers kept empty chairs for sons who never came home. Former prisoners spent decades wrestling with nightmares of starvation, disease, and the crack of rifle butts against bone. Many could never again hear the sound of rain without remembering the jungle, the mud, the endless marches under a sun that burned like punishment. Yet, from the ashes, something remarkable emerged: resilience. Singapore, the city once brought to its knees, rose again. Brick by brick, its people rebuilt it, not as a symbol of empire, but as a nation of their own making. The same generation that had witnessed defeat became the foundation of renewal. By the 1960s, Singapore stood as a sovereign state, forged not by conquest, but by determination. The echoes of 1942 did not fade. They became lessons about unity, vigilance, and the price of complacency. The war had shown that strength is not measured by fortresses or fleets, but by the will to adapt. The massive coastal guns of Singapore had pointed toward the sea, waiting for a threat that came from the jungle. In that miscalculation lay the tragedy of empire, believing in the past while the world moved forward. Across Asia, the fall of Singapore inspired countless independence movements. From Burma to India, from Indonesia to Vietnam, the idea that the Western powers could be defeated ignited a fire that could not be extinguished. It was a grim irony. Japan's conquest, meant to replace Western rule with its own empire, instead accelerated the collapse of imperialism altogether. The very war that sought to enslave Asia instead taught it the meaning of freedom. But freedom came at a cost measured not in strategy, but in human life. Over 130,000 Allied troops were taken prisoner after the surrender. Thousands died in captivity from starvation, disease, or execution. Civilians endured hunger, fear, and unspeakable loss. The scars were generational. Even decades later, survivors could still recall the smell of burning oil, the whine of bombers, the sound of the city falling apart. In the post-war years, memorials rose where bodies had once fallen. At Kranji War Cemetery, endless rows of white gravestones stand beneath the tropical sun. Each one bears a name, or sometimes only the words, "Known unto God." Birds sing softly in the trees, their calls mingling with the rustle of palm leaves. Here, history is not written in books but carved into stone. Every grave whispers a story of duty, of fear, of sacrifice. Visitors still walk those grounds today, their footsteps light on the grass. Some pause before the names of relatives lost before they were born. Others stand in silence, trying to imagine what those final days must have felt like. The smell of cordite, the heat of the flames, the feeling of a world collapsing around you. In those moments, the past is not distant, it is alive. The legacy of the fall of Singapore endures not as a tale of defeat, but as a mirror. It reflects the cost of pride, the fragility of empires, and the resilience of the human spirit. It reminds us that war is not just fought by armies, but endured by civilians, mothers, children, and ordinary men who never asked to become part of history, yet did. In the grand sweep of World War II, Singapore's fall is sometimes overshadowed by the battles of Europe or the atomic fire of Japan's end. Yet, in its tragedy, lies a truth that transcends borders, that no fortress is impregnable, no empire eternal, and no victory without consequence. When night falls over modern Singapore, its skyline glitters where once it burned. The city hums with life, a symbol of rebirth from ruin. Yet beneath the steel and glass, the ghosts remain, silent witnesses to the courage and suffering that shaped the island's soul. The wind that moves through Kranji's palm trees seems to carry their voices still. Remember us and learn. History's purpose is not to glorify, but to warn. The fall of Singapore stands as one of humanity's great lessons, that arrogance can destroy what strength builds, that cruelty breeds only vengeance, and that survival is never the same as victory. As the final lights fade and the echoes of gunfire dissolve into the distant tide, we are left with reflection, not on how the fortress fell, but on what it taught us about ourselves. That courage can exist even in defeat, that hope can endure even in occupation, and that memory carried forward is the truest form of resistance. Because history is not the story of nations, it is the story of people. And in the ruins of Singapore, among the ashes and the silence, humanity proved it could endure anything. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history video.